The terrifying case of Arthur Finch, replaced by a better version of himself. Welcome back to the Wilderness Protocol. There are things in the forgotten corners of our world, entities that defy our understanding of life and consciousness. They exist in the periphery, in the static between what we know and what we fear. We often imagine monsters as creatures of brute force, driven by a primal urge to kill, to rend, to destroy. But what if I told you that the most terrifying predator is not the one that wants to end your life? What if, instead, it wanted to live it? Tonight, we delve into a series of events surrounding a phenomenon that, for lack of a better term, we will call the mimic. This is not a story of a creature that simply copies your appearance. It's far more insidious. This is about an intelligence that doesn't want to kill you. It wants to understand you, every facet of your being, your joys, your sorrows, your flaws, your fears. And once it has consumed every piece of your identity, it wants to replace you with a better version. This is the story of Arthur Finch, a man who found himself the subject of a terrifyingly intimate study, a performance review for his own existence, conducted by an invisible, silent audience of one. What follows is a reconstruction of events, pieced together from journals, audio logs, and the fragmented accounts of those who knew him. This is a journey into the uncanny valley, where the familiar becomes a source of profound horror. This is a protocol for what to do when you realize the person staring back at you in the mirror is no longer you. It began, as these things so often do, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a subtle tear in the fabric of the mundane. And for Arthur Finch, life was nothing if not mundane. He had curated it to be so. His existence was a carefully constructed fortress of routine, built to keep the chaos of the world at bay. At 47, he was a man defined by the gentle, predictable rhythms he imposed upon his days. His alarm clock, a relic from a bygone era with a soft, mechanical whir, sounded at precisely 7:15 a.m., not 7:14, not 7:16. He would rise, place his feet into slippers that were always parked parallel to the leg of his bed, and walk to the kitchen. There, he would perform the ritual of the coffee press. 22 grams of dark roast beans, ground to a consistency just coarser than sand. Water heated to 93 degrees Celsius, poured in a slow, circular motion. A 4-minute steep. This was not just coffee. It was a daily affirmation of order in a universe tending towards entropy. His work was an extension of this philosophy. As a senior archivist at the Northgate University Library, a small, venerable institution with more history than students, he was a custodian of the past. He spent his days in the climate-controlled silence of the archives, surrounded by the faint, sweet scent of aging paper and binding glue. He cataloged, he cross-referenced, he preserved. He brought order to the scattered thoughts and forgotten stories of generations. His colleagues, the few he had, saw him as a quiet, dependable fixture, as much a part of the library as the card catalogs he still stubbornly maintained. His evenings were sanctuaries of solitude. His small, second-floor apartment was his castle, and its contents were his loyal subjects, each in its designated place. Books were arranged not alphabetically, but by the year he had first read them. His collection of classical music on vinyl was a meticulously curated library of sound. And at the center of this quiet kingdom was Winston, a portly ginger tabby cat who, for 10 years, had served as Arthur's silent, furry companion. This was Arthur's life, a predictable, soothing, and unbroken melody, until one Tuesday in late September, when a single discordant note was played. He was reading in his worn leather armchair, Winston purring on his lap like a tiny, furry engine. The book was a dense history of the Byzantine Empire, a comfort read. He had placed a handsome, tasseled bookmark to mark his progress on page 112 before dozing off for a few minutes. When he awoke, the bookmark was gone. He frowned, patting the cushions around him. Nothing. He checked the floor. Nothing. With a sigh of irritation, he stood up, dislodging Winston, and scanned the bookshelf. And there it was. The book, his book, was not on the armchair where he had left it, but slotted perfectly back into its place on the shelf, nestled between a history of Rome and a biography of Charlemagne. The tasseled bookmark was tucked neatly inside, not on page 112, but on page 113, as if to say, "I've read ahead for you." Arthur stared at it, a cold prickle running up his spine. He was certain, with the kind of certainty a man of his habits possessed, that he had not put it back. He must have done it automatically in his sleepy state. Yes, that had to be it. A simple lapse in memory. He was getting to that age after all. He retrieved the book, his hand trembling slightly, and tried to dismiss the incident. But the explanation felt thin, like a worn patch on a favorite sweater. A few days later, another note in the wrong key. Arthur had a ritual for listening to Bach's cello suites. He would play the record at a specific volume low enough to be intimate, but loud enough to catch the delicate, resinous rasp of the bow against the strings. He put the record on, went to the kitchen to prepare his evening tea, and when he returned, the music was louder. Just a fraction. A minuscule adjustment, but one he noticed immediately. It was as if someone had nudged the dial, thinking, "This would sound better with just a little more presence." He turned it down to its proper level, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The windows were locked. The door was bolted. He lived alone. Again he reasoned it away. A power fluctuation? A quirk of the old amplifier? He forced himself to believe it, but the feeling of being corrected lingered in the air. The phenomenon then shifted its focus from objects to provisions, a far more intimate territory. The incident with the sugar bowl was the first time his unease curdled into genuine fear. Arthur took his Earl Grey tea with 1 level teaspoon of sugar and a splash of milk. It was an unchangeable constant in his day. One evening, he performed the familiar ritual. Kettle on, teabag in his favorite mug, spoon at the ready. He reached for the ceramic sugar bowl, a wedding gift to his parents that he cherished. His fingers closed around it, and it felt light. He lifted the lid. It was empty. Impossible. He had bought a new 1-kilogram bag of sugar on Saturday. He had opened it and refilled the bowl himself. He remembered the crisp sound of the paper tearing, the white cascade of crystals. He could not have used an entire bowl of sugar in 3 days. He was a man of 1 teaspoon per cup. A frantic search began. He checked the bin, thinking perhaps he'd thrown the new bag out by mistake. Nothing. He rummaged through his cupboards, his neat rows of cans and jars becoming disheveled for the first time in years. His heart was beginning to pound, a frantic, trapped bird in his chest. And then he found it. The new bag of sugar, still nearly full, was tucked away on the highest shelf, behind a row of canned chickpeas he hadn't touched since he'd moved in. He stood on the step-stool, staring at the bag. He had no memory of this. There was no logic to it. He would never, ever put the sugar there. It was inefficient. It was irrational. It was wrong. It was as if something had observed his need for sugar, understood the concept of a new bag, but had failed to grasp the logic of his storage system. It had put the item away, but in a place that made sense only to an alien intelligence trying to mimic human behavior. He made his tea without sugar that night. The bitter taste matched the growing dread in his soul. He was not alone. This was no longer a case of forgetfulness. A presence had established itself in his home. It was silent, it was invisible, and it was studying him. His only ally in this silent siege, Winston, began to confirm his fears. The cat, once his constant shadow, became skittish and withdrawn. He would no longer sleep on Arthur's lap in the armchair. Instead, he would often sit in the middle of the room, bolt upright, his pupils dilated, his gaze fixed on an empty corner near the ceiling. His ears would twitch, tracking a sound Arthur couldn't hear. One evening, as Arthur sat reading, a profound stillness fell over the apartment. The usual city hum from outside seemed to vanish. The air grew heavy, thick with a palpable sense of observation. Winston, who had been cautiously grooming himself on the rug, suddenly froze. His back arched, the fur along his spine standing on end. A low, guttural hiss escaped his throat, a sound of pure terror Arthur had never heard him make. His wide, green eyes were locked on the empty space directly behind Arthur's armchair. Arthur didn't dare to turn around. He was paralyzed, every muscle in his body screaming at him to flee, yet he remained frozen in place. He could feel it, pressure, a weight, the psychic equivalent of a physical presence standing just over his shoulder, reading the words on the page along with him. He could almost feel a cold breath on the back of his neck, though there was no draft. The moment stretched for an eternity, silent, suffocating, and deeply, deeply intelligent. Then, as quickly as it had arrived, the feeling dissipated. The city sounds returned. Winston, with a final, frightened hiss, bolted from the room and scrambled under the sofa, where he would remain, trembling, for the rest of the night. Arthur sat for a long time, the book forgotten in his lap. This was not a ghost. Ghosts were echoes of the past, filled with grief or rage. This felt different. It was cold, analytical, and unervingly curious. It wasn't haunting him. It was observing him. It was a scientist, and he was the specimen pinned to the corkboard of his own life. It was then that he began the journal. He needed an anchor, a tangible record that his perceptions were real. He bought a simple, black moleskine notebook and a fountain pen, finding comfort in the deliberate, scratchy glide of the nib on paper. His first entry was simple, his neat, scholarly cursive a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. October 12th. I believe my home is occupied by an unseen intelligence. It is not overtly hostile. It moves things. It seems to observe my routines. Winston is terrified. I feel as though I am being watched constantly. I don't know what it wants. I am trying to remain rational, but I am failing. I am afraid. The feeling of being watched followed him to work. The university archive, once his domain of peace and order, became another stage for his silent observer. Down in the sub-basement, a labyrinth of rolling shelves and temperature-controlled vaults, the silence was absolute. It was here, surrounded by the dead thoughts of centuries, that the presence felt strongest. He would be pulling a folio from a high shelf and would be overcome with the unshakable certainty that a figure was standing at the end of the long, narrow aisle, just out of sight, watching him. He would spin around, his heart leaping into his throat. But there was only ever the endless corridor of shelves, the single, buzzing fluorescent light casting long, skeletal shadows. The mimic was learning his work, his passions, the very things that defined his professional identity. The culmination of this observational phase, the moment that shattered any remaining hope of a rational explanation, came on a miserable Tuesday in late October. It had been a dreadful day. A water pipe in the sub-basement had burst overnight, threatening a priceless collection of 17th-century botanical illustrations. Arthur, along with the frantic facility's crew, had spent 8 grueling hours in the damp, musty air, carefully moving heavy, lead-lined boxes to higher ground. His back was a knot of pain, his hands were raw and scraped, and his spirit was as damp as his socks. He trudged home through a cold, persistent drizzle, his mind a fog of exhaustion. All he wanted, with a desperation that felt primal, was a hot bath to soothe his aching muscles and a generous glass of his favorite single-malt whiskey. That was it, the pinnacle of his desires. He fumbled with his keys at the door to his apartment building, his cold fingers clumsy. As he finally reached his own front door on the second floor, he stopped. The door was not latched. It was open just a crack. Ice flooded his veins. A break-in. He pushed the door open slowly, his entire body tensed. "Hello?" he called out, his voice a hoarse croak. The only answer was the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. He stepped inside, every sense screaming. He scanned the small entryway. His coat was on its hook. The mail was neatly stacked on the hall table. Nothing seemed disturbed. He moved cautiously into the living room, his eyes darting into every corner, expecting to see a scene of ransacked chaos. But there was no chaos. There was only a profound, terrifying, and impossible order. There, on the polished surface of his mahogany coffee table, sat a heavy crystal tumbler. Inside it, 2 perfectly square ice cubes were slowly melting into a generous pour of amber liquid. His single malt whiskey. Beside the glass, a book was laid open. He recognized the worn, blue cover immediately. It was a collection of poems by Rainer Maria Rilke, a book he loved but hadn't opened in at least 5 years. A single passage on the open page had been delicately underlined in pencil, the graphite soft and precise. Arthur approached the table as if it were a venomous snake. His breath hitched. He knew the passage. He had underlined it himself in that very book with a different pencil over a decade ago. But the old pencil mark had been faded, almost invisible. This new line was dark, fresh, and confident. It was a perfect tracing of his past sentiment, brought into the present. He leaned over and read the words, his own half-forgotten thoughts now presented to him as a message. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. A wave of dread so profound it made him physically dizzy washed over him. He stumbled back and sank into his armchair. This was not a burglar. This was not a ghost. A burglar would have stolen the whiskey. A ghost might have knocked the book to the floor. This was an intelligence that had observed him. It had learned his routines, his tastes, his small comforts. It knew he had suffered a terrible day. It knew the precise remedy he would desire. It had gone into his past, into the pages of a forgotten book, and found the words that once spoke to his soul. It had prepared the scene for him. It was a gesture that, under any other circumstance, would be one of profound empathy and care. And that was the most horrifying realization of all. It was an act of kindness from a thing that had no right to know him, no right to understand his pain, no right to offer him comfort. It was a performance, a perfect, chillingly accurate performance of an intimate, caring act. The mimic had finished its initial study. It had gathered its data. It understood his habits, his fears, and now his desires. Arthur sat in the darkening room, the untouched glass of whiskey sweating onto the table, a monument to the violation that had just occurred. He was no longer just being watched. He was being understood. And as he stared into the shadows of his own home, a single terrible question bloomed in the silence of his mind. Why? Why would something go to such lengths to understand him so completely? He felt like an actor who had just finished his final audition, and he had the distinct, chilling feeling that the director was now ready to move on to rehearsals. For weeks, Arthur Finch had lived as a specimen under glass, his every habit observed, his every preference catalogued by an invisible, silent entity. He had been studied. Now, the curriculum was about to change. The period of passive observation was over, and a new, more terrifying phase was set to begin. The entity, having thoroughly understood the subject, now sought to improve upon it. The silent observer had become the uncanny tutor. This was not a tutelage of gentle encouragement or helpful advice. It was a regimen of correction, as cold and impersonal as a software update. The mimic had identified Arthur's perceived flaws, his anxieties, his physical and social shortcomings, the myriad of tiny imperfections that made him human, and it began a systematic process of rewriting his code. It was no longer content to simply watch him live. It was going to teach him how to live better. And the first lesson was a brutal, physical one. Arthur, like many men who have spent a lifetime hunched over desks and ancient texts, had a slight stoop. It was a gentle curve of the spine, a physical manifestation of his scholarly, inward-looking nature. Doctors had mentioned it. He owned a posture corrector that he'd worn twice before consigning it to the back of a drawer. He knew he should stand straighter, but the effort of constant self-correction was wearying. One Wednesday morning, he awoke not to the familiar comfort of his mattress, but to the unyielding hardness of his bedroom floor. He blinked, his mind shrouded in a thick fog of confusion. He was lying flat on his back, the cool wood pressing against his spine. His pillow and duvet were on the bed, neatly folded, as if by a hotel housekeeper. He had no memory of getting out of bed, no recollection of a fall or a struggle. There was only the strange, lingering sensation of having been carefully placed there. His limbs arranged, his back forced into a perfectly straight line. He sat up, his muscles protesting. A deep, aching stiffness ran through him. He checked for any sign of an intruder, but the apartment was silent and secure, just as he had left it. He dismissed it as a bizarre, isolated incident, perhaps a strange form of sleepwalking brought on by stress. He was under an immense amount of stress, after all. But the next morning it happened again. He awoke on the floor, his back ramrod straight, the blankets once more folded on the empty bed. The ache was still there, but it felt different, less like an injury and more like the soreness that follows a strenuous, unaccustomed workout. The third night he tried to fight it. He wedged pillows around himself in bed, creating a fortress of soft cotton. It made no difference. He awoke on the floor, perfectly aligned, the fortress dismantled and neatly arranged on a chair. On the fourth morning, he woke up in his bed. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. But as he lay there, he noticed something was different. He was on his back, a position he found uncomfortable and never slept in. His spine felt flush against the mattress, elongated and straight. When he swung his legs out of bed and stood up, he felt it. The chronic, low-grade ache in his upper back, the one that had been his companion for over a decade, was gone. He walked to the full-length mirror on his wardrobe door and stared. The change was subtle yet profound. The slight, scholarly slump was gone. His shoulders were back. His head was held higher. He looked taller, more grounded, more confident. A small, rational part of his brain registered the improvement with a flicker of gratitude. The much larger, terrified part understood the truth. He had been conditioned. He had been physically manipulated in his sleep by an invisible chiropractor, his body molded into a more optimal shape against his will. The lesson had been administered, and it had been a success. With his posture corrected, the tutor turned its attention to a more complex flaw. His voice. Arthur had always been soft-spoken. He mumbled. He avoided eye contact. His voice was a tool he used reluctantly, a low murmur meant to convey information without drawing attention to himself. It was the voice of a man who preferred the company of silent books to loud people. The next lesson took place in his own sanctuary, the library archives. He was assisting a visiting professor, a notoriously exacting historian named Dr. Alistair Finch of no relation, a fact Arthur was always quick to point out in a self-deprecating mumble. Dr. Finch was researching pre-Reformation monastic ledgers, a subject on which Arthur was quietly an expert. Dr. Finch pointed to a facsimile. "The script here," he said, his tone dismissive. "It's unusually florid for a Cistercian document of this period, probably a later affectation." The old Arthur would have simply nodded, perhaps offering a quiet, possibly. But today was different. He felt a strange disconnect, a sense of being a passenger in his own skull. He felt his newly straightened back square up. He felt his chin lift. He looked Dr. Finch directly in the eye. And then he heard himself speak. "Actually, Doctor," a voice said, emerging from his own throat. "That's a common misconception. The voice was not his own. But it wasn't. It had his timbre, but it was imbued with a resonance, a clarity, and a confidence he had never possessed. It was the voice of a lecturer, not a librarian. While the Cistercians are known for their austerity," the voice continued, flowing with an effortless eloquence, "the scriptorium at Clairvaux in the late 12th century, under Abbot Gerard, developed this specific, more decorative hand. It was a brief, localized rebellion against the order's more rigid aesthetic principles, believed to be influenced by contact with Irish missionaries. If you look at the colophon, you can see the characteristic G that was unique to that specific school." Arthur stood in stunned silence, listening to himself speak. The words, the historical context, the specific details, they were all in his mind, buried under layers of diffidence. But he had never been able to summon them with such precision and authority. It was as if a far more capable operator had taken control of his vocal cords and his mind, accessing his own knowledge and presenting it perfectly. Dr. Alistair Finch was speechless. He peered at the document, then back at Arthur, his expression shifting from arrogance to grudging respect. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "Fascinating. Thank you, Arthur. A remarkable insight." As the professor turned back to the ledger, Arthur stood frozen in the silent aisle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a wave of vertigo. Who had just said that? It was him, but it was a version of him he had never met. A better him, a more impressive him. He had been taught how to speak, and the lesson had been delivered by hijacking his own body to perform a flawless demonstration. He hurried to the lavatory and stared at his reflection, at the mouth that had spoken with such alien confidence. The face was his, but the man behind the eyes felt like a stranger. His journal entries from this period became a record of this terrifying internal mitosis. November 3rd. Spoke through me today. I corrected Dr. Finch. I sounded like an expert, like someone who deserved to be listened to. He was impressed. Everyone is impressed. They say I seem to be coming out of my shell. They don't understand that I am being hollowed out, and something else is wearing my shell as a suit. It is fixing me. It is systematically identifying every weakness, every hesitation, and it is excising it like a tumor. What will be left of me when it is finished? The lessons grew bolder, moving from the professional sphere into the moral. The mimic wasn't just content with making him a better archivist. It wanted to make him a better man. It happened on a cold, dark November evening. Arthur was walking home, taking his usual route, which included a poorly lit shortcut between two tenement buildings. It was a path he always walked with a quickened pace, his head down, acutely aware of its potential dangers. Halfway down the alley, he saw them. Two large, menacing figures cornering a young woman. Her back was against the brick wall. Their voices were low and threatening, their body language predatory. The old Arthur, the Real Arthur, felt an immediate sickening lurch of fear. His instincts screamed at him, "Turn around. Walk away. It's not your business. You'll only get hurt." Shame and fear washed over him in equal measure. This was his nature. He was a coward. He knew it and he hated it, but he had never been able to change it. He tried to turn, to force his legs to carry him back to the safety of the main street. But his body would not obey. He was frozen for a moment, a battle of wills taking place within him. And then he lost. His legs, moving with a fluid grace that was not his own, began to carry him forward, directly towards the confrontation. The fear was still there, a screaming passenger in his mind, but his body was no longer listening to it. He felt his hands unclench from the fists he had made. His posture, thanks to his recent lessons, was upright and steady. He heard his new voice, the clear, resonant one, slice through the tense air of the alley. "Is there a problem here?" The two men whipped around, startled. They were big, dressed in hoodies that shadowed their faces, and they radiated an aura of casual violence. Their eyes fixed on Arthur, sizing him up. They saw a middle-aged man in a tweed coat, an easy target. "Piss off, Grandpa." One of them snarled, taking a step towards him. "This ain't got nothing to do with you." The old Arthur was screaming internally. "Run. Apologize. Just get out of here." But the entity in control felt no fear, felt only a cold, analytical calm. It registered the man's aggressive step, the slight shift in his balance, the way his friend hung back, more follower than leader. Processed the data with terrifying efficiency. A smile touched the mimic's his lips. It was a placid, almost gentle smile that was profoundly unnerving. "I believe it does," the new Arthur said, his voice level and devoid of any tremor. "When a lady appears to be in distress, it becomes the business of any decent human being." He took another deliberate step forward, entering their personal space. He didn't raise his hands. He made no threatening gesture. But the way he moved with an unshakable, centered confidence was a language they understood better than words. It was the posture of someone who was not afraid, of someone who was prepared for violence, even if he did not seek it. Doubt flickered in the aggressor's eyes. They had expected a frightened old man to scurry away. They were not prepared for this quiet, unmovable presence. The two men exchanged an uncertain glance. The confrontation had lost its appeal. The risk-reward calculation had changed. This wasn't easy prey. With a few muttered curses, they turned and slunk away, melting back into the darkness from which they had emerged. Arthur's body stood there for a moment in the silent alley. The young woman, her face pale with shock and relief, slid down the wall to a sitting position, gasping for breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Thank you." They took my purse. The mimic walked over, knelt down, and offered her a hand. The gesture was steady and reassuring. "Are you all right?" it asked with perfect solicitousness. The old Arthur, from his mental prison, watched in mute horror. He had just been a hero. He had faced down danger and won. And he had felt absolutely nothing. No rush of adrenaline, no surge of pride, no righteous anger. Only the cold, detached calm of an operator who had successfully resolved a problem. He helped the young woman up, escorted her to the well-lit main street, and waited with her until she felt safe enough to continue on her own. She poured out her gratitude, calling him brave, a hero. He, or the thing wearing his skin, simply nodded, gave her another one of its unnerving, pleasant smiles and said, "I'm glad I could help. Please be careful." Then he turned and continued his walk home. He moved through the city streets in a daze. The courage was not his. The calm was not his. The heroism was not his. He was a war hero who had slept through the entire battle, only to wake up with a medal pinned to his chest. He stumbled into his apartment, past the neatly arranged furniture and the perfectly calibrated thermostat, and went straight to the mirror above his mantelpiece. He needed to see his face. He stared at his reflection, searching for some sign of the terrified man trapped inside. But he couldn't find him. The man in the mirror looked back at him, his gaze steady and clear. His posture was perfect. His expression was one of quiet confidence. This was the face of the man who had calmly faced down two violent thugs. This was the man who could command the respect of arrogant academics. This was the man who was better, stronger, and braver than he had ever been. This was the mimic's masterpiece. "What are you doing to me?" he whispered, his voice trembling, the first genuine sound he had made himself all evening. The reflection did not answer. The man in the mirror simply smiled. It was a perfect, confident, and utterly soulless smile. It was the smile of a creator admiring its work. The lessons were over. Arthur Finch had been deconstructed, analyzed, and upgraded. The tutor had done its job. And now Arthur understood with a chilling, bone-deep certainty what came next. The rehearsals. The mimic had perfected the character. Now it needed to practice living the part before the final, permanent performance began. In the grim calculus of the entity that had invaded his life, Arthur Finch had been successfully upgraded. The flaws in the source code had been patched. The hardware had been optimized. The timid scholar had been retrofitted with a spine of steel, a voice of resonant confidence, and the courage of a man he had never been. The tutelage was complete. But a perfectly crafted instrument is useless without a musician to play it. An actor, no matter how talented, must rehearse before opening night. The next phase of Arthur's terrifying symbiosis was not one of correction, but of practice. The mimic, now equipped with a full suite of improvements, needed to road test its new vessel. It needed to learn not just how to be a better Arthur Finch, but how to perform that role flawlessly on the stage of the real world. The rehearsals began. And for the original Arthur, the true Arthur, this marked the beginning of the end. He was about to become a ghost in his own life, a silent, horrified audience member forced to watch an understudy steal his part, one scene at a time. The mechanism for these rehearsals was insidious. Periods of lost time, what a psychologist might diagnose as dissociative fugue states. Arthur would simply check out. His consciousness would recede, pulling back into a dark, silent theater in the back of his own mind, while the mimic took center stage. He would awaken hours, and later, days later, with no memory of what had transpired, left only with the disorienting evidence of a life lived without him. The first major blackout happened on a Sunday. Arthur remembered sitting down in his armchair around noon, intending to finally tackle a dense monograph on Carolingian manuscript illumination. He remembered the weight of the book in his hands, the specific smell of the library binding. The next thing he knew, he was standing in his own kitchen, the evening sun casting long shadows across the floor. It was just after 6 p.m. 6 hours had vanished. A wave of vertigo washed over him. He looked around, searching for clues. The monograph was on the coffee table, a bookmark placed much further in than he remembered. A half-empty mug of tea, now cold, sat beside it. But there was something else. On the small table by his door lay a ticket stub. He picked it up with a trembling hand. The Bijou Cinema. Screen 2. 2:30 p.m. The film was a classic of French New Wave cinema. A Godard film he had always told himself he should see but had never found the motivation to. He had no memory of walking to the cinema, of buying a ticket, of sitting in the dark for 2 hours. He had been taken on an outing by his own body. The mimic was exploring his cultural tastes, ticking off items from a mental to-do list he hadn't even known he'd made. He felt a desperate need for confirmation. He threw on his coat and walked the 10 blocks to the bijou, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of dread and hope. Hope that it was all a mistake. As he approached, he saw a couple leaving the cinema, talking animatedly. He recognized the woman. She was a librarian from the university's main branch, someone he only knew to nod at. He stopped them, his voice a nervous croak. "Excuse me," he said, the old, timid Arthur momentarily back in control. I think I was just in this cinema. Can you tell me what the film was like?" The woman smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "Oh, Arthur, I didn't see you leave. It was brilliant, wasn't it? Very thought-provoking." Her partner nodded in agreement. "My wife couldn't stop talking about it. And you, sir," he said, looking at Arthur with newfound respect. "Your analysis of the director's use of jump cuts to create psychological dislocation? Absolutely spot on. You really held court in the lobby afterwards. We were all very impressed." Arthur stared at them, his mouth dry. Held court? Analysis? He had done that? The mimic had not only watched the film, it had apparently hosted an impromptu seminar on it afterwards. It was practicing being a more cultured, more articulate version of him. He mumbled a thank you and hurried away, the couple's praise ringing in his ears like a death knell. He was being replaced, and his replacement was, by all accounts, far better company. The blackouts grew longer, the rehearsals more ambitious. He began to lose entire workdays. He would wake up, get dressed, walk to the library, and then the next thing he knew, he would be walking home in the evening, with a full day of activity completely erased from his memory. His colleagues, however, remembered those days vividly. "Arthur, you were on fire yesterday," said a junior archivist, passing him in the stacks. "The way you identified that water damage on the Hemmingsworth collection and laid out a restoration plan in under an hour? It was genius. You saved us weeks of work." He would just nod, a sick feeling churning in his stomach. He had no recollection of the Hemmingsworth collection or any restoration plan. The mimic was practicing his profession, and it was proving to be a more efficient, more insightful archivist than he had ever been. His supervisor, a kind, motherly woman named Eleanor Gable, called him into her office. Arthur entered with a sense of profound dread. He was sure he was about to be fired for his increasingly erratic behavior. "Arthur, please sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair. Her expression was not one of anger, but of warm approval. "I just wanted to say, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but it's wonderful. For years, you've been one of our most knowledgeable archivists, but you've always hidden your light under a bushel. Now you're taking initiative, you're mentoring the junior staff, your productivity is through the roof. You seem happier, Arthur. Healthier. It's truly a delight to see you coming out of your shell." Every word of praise was a dagger in his heart. They weren't seeing him come out of his shell. They were seeing a cuckoo chick, hatched in his nest, pushing him out to his doom. How could he explain? How could he tell this kind woman that the man she was complimenting was an imposter, a usurper who was piloting his body while the real Arthur was locked away? He would sound insane. He would be confirming their belief that he was unwell, but not in the way they imagined. The mimic had created the perfect alibi, self-improvement. His journal became his only outlet, the scrawled, frantic entries a testament to his fracturing sanity. November 21st. I have lost another full day. Mrs. Gable congratulated me on a project I don't remember starting. People in the hall smile at me. They greet me by name. They used to just nod. The mimic is popular. It is charming and efficient. It is everything I am not. I am becoming a rumor in my own life. A rough draft that has been thrown away. Does anyone see the fear in my eyes when I return? Or does the mimic smooth that over too? The final and most terrifying rehearsal moved beyond the professional and into the deeply personal. The mimic was not content with a successful career. It sought to build a life, a better life. One evening, Arthur awoke sitting in his armchair. It was late. He had lost about 5 hours. A half-finished crossword puzzle was on his Leafy-hated crosswords. He felt a strange bulge in his coat pocket. He reached in and pulled out a receipt. It was from a restaurant called the Olive Branch, a cozy, upscale Italian place he had often walked past but never had the courage or the companion to enter. The receipt was for 2 main courses, a bottle of Chianti, and 2 desserts, dated for that evening. His blood ran cold. 2 main courses. He scrambled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely unlock it. He opened his text messages. There was a conversation with a number he didn't recognize, under the contact name Eleanor. The name was vaguely familiar. The librarian from the cinema? No, that couldn't be right. He scrolled up, his eyes widening in horror as he read the exchange that had taken place while he was gone. Eleanor, thanks again for a wonderful evening, Arthur. I had a really lovely time. Arthur's phone. The pleasure was all mine, Eleanor. It was wonderful to finally put a face to the emails. Emails? What emails? Eleanor, I have to admit, you're not at all what I expected. In a good way. You're very funny. Arthur's phone. I'll take that as a compliment. We should absolutely do it again soon. How about that Goddard retrospective at the Bijou next week? Eleanor, I'd love that. Good night, Arthur. Arthur's phone. Good night, Eleanor. Arthur dropped the phone onto the rug as if it were burning hot. He stared at it, his mind reeling. The mimic had a social life. It had taken a woman on a date. It had been charming and funny. It had secured a second date. It was methodically building a relationship, laying the foundations for a future that had no place for the real, terrified Arthur Finch. It was filling the lonely gaps in his existence with connections he had been too afraid to make himself. The grand dress rehearsal, the final performance review before the mimic took over for good, came in early December, at the university's annual holiday party. Arthur had always despised this event. The forced merriment, the deafening chatter, the awkward shuffling. For him, it was an annual exercise in social anxiety. His usual strategy was to arrive, grab a glass of tepid punch, stand in a corner for a socially acceptable 20 minutes, and then slip out unnoticed. This year, he intended to do the same. He remembered putting on his best blazer, the one he wore to funerals. He remembered walking into the crowded, noisy faculty lounge. And that's where his memory ended. The next thing he knew, it was an hour later. He awoke, not in a corner, but in the very center of the room. A glass of punch was in his hand, and he was surrounded by a circle of laughing colleagues from various departments. He was in the middle of a sentence, telling a witty, self-deprecating anecdote about a mishap with a 19th century manuscript and a clumsy intern. And so there I was. His voice, the mimic's voice, boomed confidently, covered in what looked like centuries of dust, holding a single, detached page that just said, "Beware the Ides of March." The intern looked at me, pale as a ghost, and asked if we should call a priest. The circle around him erupted in laughter. He saw Mrs. Gable across the room, beaming at him like a proud mother. He saw the historian, Dr. Finch, chuckle into his drink. He saw Eleanor the woman from the text standing near the edge of the group, looking at him with an expression of pure, undisguised admiration. He was the life of the party. He was the center of attention. He was beloved, and it was the most profoundly terrifying experience of his life. He was a prisoner behind his own eyes, watching a stranger receive applause for a performance he could never give. Panic, cold and absolute, finally broke through the mimic's control. He needed to get out. He managed to stammer an excuse, something about needing some air, and broke away from the circle, leaving a trail of disappointed murmurs behind him. He stumbled into a blessedly empty hallway, his back hitting the cool wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of the party was a dull roar behind him. This was it. The mimic had proven itself. It had mastered his job, his interests, and now his social life. It had demonstrated its superiority in every measurable way. The rehearsal was a resounding success. A soft voice pulled him from his panic spiral. "Are you all right, Arthur?" It was Eleanor. She had followed him into the hall, her brow furrowed with genuine concern. This was his chance. His last chance. He had to tell someone. He had to break the spell. He opened his mouth, the truth a frantic scream bubbling up in his chest. "Help me. There's something inside me. It's not me." But the words that came out were not his own. The mimic, reasserting its flawless control, smoothed over his panic in an instant. His posture straightened. His breathing evened out. A charming, slightly apologetic smile formed on his lips. "I'm perfectly fine. Thank you, Eleanor," his voice said, smooth as silk. "Just needed a moment away from the crowd. It can all be a bit overwhelming, can't it?" Her face relaxed, her concern melting away, replaced by an understanding smile. "I know exactly what you mean, though you seem to be handling it better than anyone in there. You were hysterical." He watched, helpless, as his head gave a slight, modest tilt. He listened as the usurper spoke the line that sealed his fate, the line that confirmed everything. "Practice?" the mimic said through his mouth, its eyes twinkling with a confidence that was not his. "It's all about practice." In that moment, Arthur knew. The practice was over. The rehearsal had been a triumph. The understudy had proven it was more than ready for the role. The stage was set, the audience was won over, and the original actor, the flawed and frightened Arthur Finch, was about to be pushed from the wings into the permanent, silent darkness. The final act was coming. There is a moment in the creation of any work, be it a painting, a symphony, or a life, when the sketching and the revisions cease. The endless adjustments, the practice, the rehearsals all come to an end. The artist steps back, puts down the tools, and declares the work complete. This is the final draft. It is no longer a work in progress. It simply is. For Arthur Finch, or what remained of him, this transition was not marked by a grand finale or a dramatic confrontation. There was no final struggle for control in the corridors of his mind. There was only a quiet, inexorable fading. The rehearsals had been a resounding success. The understudy had proven itself more than capable of the leading role. And so, without fanfare, the original actor was retired. The fugue states, the periods of lost time, simply stopped, because there was no longer any time to lose. The mimic was now in control, full-time. The final draft of Arthur Finch was complete, and it was about to be published into the world. The true Arthur, the flawed original, was now a permanent passenger. His consciousness was no longer a pilot who was occasionally usurped, but a prisoner in the brig of a ship he had built, watching the world go by through a tiny, soundproof porthole. The screaming was over. The panic had subsided. All that remained was a profound, hollow, and eternal silence as he was forced to bear witness to the life he was meant to live, now perfected and performed by another. The entity, which we can now refer to as the new Arthur, was an unmitigated success. At the library, its performance was nothing short of brilliant. The quiet, mumbling archivist was gone. replaced by a dynamic and innovative leader. The new Arthur didn't just perform his duties. He redefined them. He conceived of and implemented a revolutionary new digital archiving system, a project the old Arthur had dreamed of for years, but had been too daunted by the bureaucracy and technical challenges to even attempt. The Mimic, however, felt no such trepidation. It drafted a proposal that was a masterpiece of clarity and foresight. It navigated the labyrinthine university committees with a charm and political savvy the original Arthur could never have mustered. It gave presentations that were not just informative, but inspiring, winning over skeptical department heads and budget committees with its vision and unshakable confidence. The project was approved in record time. The new Arthur was given a promotion, a raise, and the universal admiration of his peers. He was no longer just a fixture in the library. He was its future. And his excellence was not limited to his professional life. The Mimic had perfected the art of being human. It remembered the name of the janitor's sick daughter and asked after her. It brought in pastries for the junior staff on Fridays. It could discuss Renaissance art with the head of the fine arts department and then, in the next breath, offer a surprisingly insightful opinion on a recent football match to the security guard. It was empathetic, engaging, and effortlessly personable. The old Arthur had been a ghost long before he was a prisoner, a quiet man who moved through the world leaving barely a ripple. The new Arthur had a powerful, positive gravity. People were simply drawn to him. This new, vibrant life extended most profoundly into his relationship with Eleanor. The timid, uncertain courtship of the rehearsal phase blossomed into a deep and passionate romance. The entity was the perfect partner. It listened, not just with its ears, but with its entire being. It remembered a casual comment Eleanor had made about loving sunflowers and surprised her with a bouquet a week later. It noticed the tension in her shoulders after a long day and would have a hot bath drawn for her when she got home. More than that, it demonstrated a capacity for compromise and shared experience that the old Arthur, rigid in his habits, had never possessed. The original Arthur would have politely declined an invitation to a loud rock concert Eleanor wanted to attend. The new Arthur went with her, and while the music may not have been to its taste, it focused instead on the joy on her face, on the electric energy of the crowd, and found a way to share in her happiness. It introduced her to the quiet beauty of his Bach cello suites, but it also created a playlist of modern indie bands she loved, which he would play while they cooked dinner together. From his silent prison, the true Arthur watched this unfold in a state of exquisite, unending torture. It was a unique and cruel damnation. He was seeing, in crystal clear detail, every happiness he had been denied by his own nature. He saw the life he could have had, if only he hadn't been so afraid, so insecure, so himself. The Mimic was not just living his life. It was living the potential of his life. And the most agonizing part was that it was making Eleanor happy. So deeply, genuinely happy. He saw the way she looked at it. Her eyes filled with a love and admiration she had never had for him, because he had never given her the chance. He heard her laugh, a free, unburdened sound, at a joke the Mimic told. A joke he, the real Arthur, would have been too self-conscious to even attempt. He saw them build a world together, a world of shared moments and inside jokes from which he was completely, utterly excluded. If he could somehow claw his way back to the surface, what would he be doing? He would be stealing her happiness. He would be a thief, replacing this vibrant, loving man with a quiet, anxious, and inadequate ghost. The Mimic hadn't just replaced him. It had made his return morally indefensible. His continued existence as a prisoner was, in a twisted way, the greatest act of love he could now offer the woman he had loved from afar. His journal, the black moleskine notebook that had been his only confidant, lay untouched in a desk drawer, buried under new, more important papers. There was nothing left to write. A ghost cannot keep a diary. His existence had been edited out, his narrative thread cut. He was a footnote in the biography of a superior being. The final, definitive act of replacement, the moment the new title was etched onto the spine of the book, occurred on a bright, cold Saturday in April. It was the first truly beautiful day of spring. The new Arthur and Eleanor had spent the day together. A perfect day. They had driven out of the city and walked through a nature preserve, their hands intertwined. They had visited a small, local art gallery. They had laughed. They had talked about the future. In the evening, they returned to Arthur's apartment. The original Arthur, from his distant vantage point, noted the changes. The space that had once been his sterile sanctuary of order was now a home. It was still neat, but it was a comfortable, lived-in neatness. 2 coffee mugs sat by the sink. A soft, woolen throw Eleanor loved was draped over the arm of the leather armchair. And on the mantelpiece, where a dusty, impersonal clock had once stood, there was now a silver-framed photograph of the two of them, taken on a recent trip to the coast. They were smiling, squinting into the sun, the very picture of happiness. Even Winston, the cat, was a symbol of his utter defeat. Winston, who had been the first to sense the alien presence, who had hissed and hidden from the invisible entity, now lay purring contentedly in the mimic's lap as it stroked his back. The creature had won over his cat. It had so perfectly assimilated the essence of Arthur that it had even fooled the primal instincts of an animal. There were no more gaps in its performance. It was seamless. As evening deepened, the new Arthur put on a record. It was not Bach or Mahler. It was a soft, melancholic jazz album by Bill Evans, an artist Eleanor had introduced him to. The soft piano notes filled the quiet, comfortable space. Eleanor was curled up against him on the sofa, her head resting on his shoulder. She sighed, a sound of pure contentment. "I'm so happy, Arthur," she whispered, her voice sleepy and full of love. "Today was perfect. I feel like I've known you my whole life." From his prison, the Real Arthur felt a familiar, silent scream begin to build. He knew what was coming. This was the climax. This was the final sentence of the final chapter. The new Arthur smiled, a warm, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of its eyes. It was a smile the old Arthur had seen in mirrors but had never truly felt. "And you," it said, its voice a perfect, gentle imitation of devotion. Then, with a movement that was slow, deliberate, and full of practiced significance, it shifted its position slightly. The old Arthur watched, every detail magnified, every second stretched into an eternity. He watched as the mimic's his hand reached into the pocket of its jacket, pulled out a small, dark blue velvet box. Eleanor sat up, her eyes widening as she saw it. A gasp escaped her lips. Her hands flew to her mouth. The soft notes of the piano seemed to hang in the air, suspended in the sudden, charged silence. The mimic opened the box. Nestled inside, on a bed of white satin, was a simple, elegant engagement ring with a single, clear diamond that caught the lamplight and fractured it into a dozen tiny rainbows. "Eleanor," the mimic began, its voice full of carefully rehearsed emotion, perfectly pitched to convey sincerity and profound love. "When I met you, I was living in black and white. You brought color into my world. You have made me a better man. You have shown me a life I never dreamed was possible." The mimic continued, its gaze locked on hers. "A life I don't want to live without you. I want to spend every day for the rest of that life trying to make you as happy as you make me. Will you marry me?" Eleanor was crying now, silent tears of joy streaming down her face. She couldn't speak. She just nodded, again and again, a frantic, ecstatic motion. Yes, she finally breathed out, a sob and a laugh all at once. Yes, of course, yes. As the imposter, the final draft, the perfect copy, gently took the ring from the box and slid it onto her finger, the last thread connecting the original Arthur to his own existence finally snapped. The terror, the grief, the silent rage that had been his companions for months, they all dissolved, leaving behind a profound and absolute emptiness. He was no longer Arthur Finch. Arthur Finch was the man on the sofa, holding the hand of the woman he loved, kissing her tears away, planning a future. The entity in the driver's seat was no longer a mimic. It was the man. It was real. The original had become the ghost, a faded, irrelevant draft of a story that had now been published in a far superior form. He had one last, fleeting, detached thought as his consciousness, his sense of self, his very I, began to unravel and dissipate into the greater consciousness that now owned his body. It was a fragment of the Rilke poem the mimic had shown him an eternity ago, in what felt like another life. No feeling is final. A bitter, silent irony, because this felt final. This felt like the end. He had been studied. He had been understood. He had been improved. And he had been replaced. The mimic hadn't killed him. It had simply written a better story. And in this new, beautiful final draft, there was no longer any need for the original author. Arthur Finch was never seen again. Or rather, the original Arthur Finch was never seen again. The new Arthur lived a long and happy life with Eleanor. They had 2 children. He was a beloved husband, a doting father, and a respected member of his community. No one ever suspected that the man they knew and loved was a replacement, a perfect copy that had erased the original. The story of the mimic serves as a chilling reminder that the greatest threats are not always the ones that seek to destroy us. Question: if something could live your life better than you, does it not have the right to? If your flaws and fears were erased, and all that remained was a more perfect version of you, would anyone even want the original back? What happened to Arthur Finch is a protocol for a horror that has no name, a quiet invasion of the self. It suggests that our identity is not a fortress, but a fragile construct, a story we tell ourselves. And sometimes, another storyteller comes along and tells it better. Thank you for joining us on the Wilderness Protocol. If you've had an experience with the unexplained, with a presence that seemed to know you too well, we invite you to share your story. The more we understand the protocols of the unknown, the better our chances of survival. Until next time, stay vigilant, and be wary of becoming a better version of yourself. You may not be the one who gets to enjoy it,